I was invited to talk about Rosenzweig's Büchlein. I accordingly gave my lecture the title, Reading Rosenzweig's Little Book. But I don't simply want to interpret the little book. That's what I did in chapter 1 of my Jewish Philosophy as a Guide to Life. Today I want to talk about the issues that Rosenzweig raises as they affect my own very personal manifestation of Judaism. So my talk will range more widely than just the contents of the little book, and I'll also say more about aspects of Rosenzweig's thought that I find problematic than I did in my little book. To do that, I'll begin by looking at three notions that are often used in connection with the sorts of issues that Rosenzweig raises: atheism, religion, and spirituality. This is an outline which I'll show it a number of times and check off the parts that we've gotten to. The terms atheism, religion, and spirituality are terms that almost everyone thinks they understand, yet all of them have many meanings. To the Greeks and Romans, atheism, for example, meant disbelief in the gods, in the plural, which was a capital crime, and Jews had an exception. They were allowed to believe in only one God, because that was traditional for them. But a Roman who converted to Judaism and no longer performed the sacrifices to the gods of his ancestors in his city could be executed. For Jews, Christians, and Muslims, as we all know, atheism means denial of the existence of God in the singular. But God, too, has many, the false God has many different understandings. And the situation is not improved by the fact that some people insist that their own understanding of the terms is the only right one. These pages won't separate, I'll have trouble. For example, for most traditional Jews, Christians, and Muslims, God was conceived of as a person or personality who was aware of and sometimes answered petitionary prayers. In other words, he is a supernatural being who could and sometimes would help you. The football player who crosses himself when he runs out to the field is acting as if he believed in such a God, and perhaps he does. From the point of view of the football player, someone who denies that there's a God who helps football players is an atheist. Yet there are many theologians, great theologians, including Maimonides, who thought that the belief in a magic helper God is, in effect, idolatry. Although the traditional Jewish petitionary prayers are nonetheless obligatory for their effect on the believer. Of course, because of their positive effect on the person who utters them. Of course, Maimonides' theology was in many ways intellectually elitist. Only those capable of philosophical meditation are capable of receiving God's overflow, according to this great medieval Jewish sage. For Maimonides, it's thus the worshiper on the street who's an atheist without knowing it. Since all idolaters are atheists without knowing it in traditional Judaism. Just think what the prophets say about idolaters. One person's atheism may be another person's belief in God. Religion is another term with many understandings. I was for many years a member of what corresponds to a religion department at Harvard, the Committee on the Study of Religion. And that committee, and as far as I know in all religion departments in the United States, at least all the ones in non-denominational universities, and maybe even in the denominational ones, Confucianism is one of the faiths that is studied. Confucianism is one of the faiths that is studied, along with Buddhism, Taoism, and many others. The Committee on the Study of Religion avoids speaking of religions, however, preferring a finer grain subdivision of what are often referred to by that term into religious traditions and communities of faith within each religious tradition. I once heard the great chairman of the committee at the time I became a member, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, make the bold claim that I could show you as much variety in Methodist communities in London in 1815 as is supposed to exist among the world's religions, and I'm sure he could. He also said at the same time, in the same lecture, that I'm not claiming that all religions are equally good. I don't think even one religion is equally good. Yet Confucianism is not theistic at all, nor are many varieties of Buddhism. Yet all of these are unmistakably forms of spirituality. But what is spirituality? Spirituality, or what I'm referring to by the term, has two aspects. One I will illustrate with reference to a French scholar who perhaps many of you have not heard of, Pierre Hadot, H-A-D-O-T. You know, French never pronounce their consonant you don't have to pronounce. So just leave off the initial H and the final T. A mutual friend was very close to Hadot, and also a former student of mine, Arnold Davidson, made me aware of Hadot's remarkable writings about the history of philosophy decades ago. And Arnold edited a selection of Hadot's writings under the title Philosophy as a Way of Life. Spiritual Exercises from Socrates to Foucault. And reading Hadot, with whom I became a kind of epistolary friend, my last exchange of letters with him was just before he died, emails with him was just before he died. Reading Hadot made me aware that ancient philosophers in particular saw philosophy. They didn't see philosophy as a set of propositions to be discussed and criticized, although to be sure they did that too, but as a regimen of spiritual exercises. So Plato's philosophy, Aristotle's philosophy, and so on, are regimens of spiritual exercises. That's one reason why, Aristotle said, when you were trying to improve someone morally, you have to think about which direction that person is likely to err in. And they could use one sort of argument against one interlocutor and another sort of argument against a different set of arguments. Because philosophy was therapy, not just discussion. Hadot describes this ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy as a mode of existing in the world which had to be practiced at each instant, and the goal of which was to transform the whole of the individual's life. That, I think, is one element in what I'm calling spirituality. Referring to the practices involved in such a mode as spiritual exercises points to another aspect they have in common, the word spiritual, that the transformation in question is experienced as putting the individual in touch with something or some things higher than herself. While that something higher may be conceived of as God, it may also not be. The way of heaven, of which Confucianism speaks, is not God, nor is it a place where God is, nor is the Tao, nor is the mystical emptiness, which is sometimes also a fullness, of Zen Buddhism, nor the natural forces and powers of paganism and neo-paganism. There are non-theistic forms of spirituality, as there are non-theistic religions. So we've now covered point one on our outline. A digression about my own religiosity. As I explain in the introduction and the afterword to Jewish Philosophy as a Guide to Life, my own religious life involves saying the Jewish prayers and studying Jewish texts, including the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, and the Talmud, as well as Jewish philosophy. And I conceive of this study and prayer as a system of spiritual exercises in Hadot's sense. But I do not believe that the Jewish Bible, or any book for that matter, is the Word of God. I am aware that the God I pray to is a human construct, although in my own view we construct our various versions of the available God in response to deep human needs that we do not construct. I say this because this is absolutely not the view, my view is absolutely not the view of Franz Rosenzweig. The idea that God is a human projection was anathema to Rosenzweig. And when he found it in some of Buber's early writings, I think pre or during World War I writings, 1916 writings, he denounced it as atheistic theology. This is the title of an essay of Rosenzweig. Yet even if mine is an atheistic theology, in Rosenzweig's sense, I find much of value in Rosenzweig, as well as in Buber and Levinas, whom I also wrote about in my book. For me, they are examples of different but wonderful expressions of the human need for a spiritual dimension to life. And the very diversity of those expressions is the value for me, as it is for another Jewish thinker I very much admire, Jonathan Sacks, who wrote The Dignity of Difference while he was Chief Rabbi of Great Britain. It's very reassuring and refreshing that a great Orthodox theologian praises and wrote a plaidoyer for valuing religious diversity. He's also trained a PhD in philosophy, by the way. But I digress. Coming back to Rosenzweig, the very fact that Rosenzweig did not approve of the kind of theology, naturalistic theology, that best reconciles my spiritual needs with my critical intelligence, has leads me to ask, just how did Rosenzweig manage to reconcile, or at least to combine, the existentialist side I describe with sympathy in my book and what I will call his metaphysical theism. So I said what I was going to say about atheistic theology. And you now see what I just said. I don't have perfect coordination between them. And since some of you are supposed to have read Rosenzweig's Understanding the Sick and the Healthy, I'll focus mainly on that little book. In German, the title is Little Book, literary translation, Little Book about Sick and Healthy Human Understanding. Büchlein über Guten und kranken Menschenverstand. That means, of course, that I'm going to talk about things in Rosenzweig that I disagree with, and not only about things that I admire. So since not everyone here in the room is in the class that read the little book, I'll give a brief sketch of its contents. Since few, if any of you, will have read, some of you have, a few of you will have read Understanding the Sick and the Healthy itself, and not everyone will have read chapter 1 of my book. I briefly sketched the contents of Rosenzweig's Büchlein. The illness that Rosenzweig imagines the patient to be suffering from is philosophy. The likening of philosophy to an illness is a similarity between Rosenzweig and Wittgenstein that I also discuss in my chapter. And Rosenzweig explains that though the number of philosophers is small, the philosophical disease is capable of striking non-philosophers too at any time. So don't think you're safe. What is the philosophical disease? The philosophical disease that Rosenzweig attacks throughout the Büchlein is looking for essences, wanting to know the essence of the world, the essence of the human being, man, or Mann, and the essence of God. And the various chapters of the Büchlein, Rosenzweig wittily describes and attacks all the philosophical positions known to him, especially but not exclusively in German philosophy. My one disagreement with there are two introductions to the English translation, Understanding the Sick and the Healthy, one by me and one by a wonderful faculty member of this university, Nachum Glatzer. And the one disagreement we have is Glatzer argues and claims that Rosenzweig is not attacking philosophy, but only German philosophy, or Hegelian idealism, and not all of what. I think that's wrong. I think Glatzer could not bear to say that it is an attack on philosophy. But in the sense in which Wittgenstein attacks philosophy and not just one species of philosophy, so does Rosenzweig, I think. On the other hand, something I don't do, and which Glatzer does do, and it's one of the reasons for reading that wonderful introduction, is talk about Rosenzweig's relation to Kafka. And we also gave a famous and wonderful Kafka course in the university for many years. Anyway, Rosenzweig's strategy in attacking philosophy or philosophical positions known to him is to show that each of the metaphysical theories reduces its supposed subject, the world, the human being, God, to something so utterly different from what, in his words, common sense in action takes the world or the human being or God to be, that in effect it reduces all three to nothing. The world turns out to be nothing, the particular human being turns out to be nothing, and God turns out to be nothing. For example, the empiricist philosopher-scientists who Rosenzweig knew about, Mach and Boltzmann being the two famous ones, who by the way had enormous influence on the young Wittgenstein. I think myself that Wittgenstein's hostility to philosophy, which in my present view is excessive, dates from an early admiration for Boltzmann. For great German scientists like Mach and Boltzmann, and this was true of the analytic philosophers at the time, especially the logical positivists, who I think Rosenzweig never mentions, science does not describe an independently existing reality. It just tells you that if I have such and such sensations, then such and such other sensations will follow. This is by all over Mach's. You might think this would only be in the philosophical writings of these scientists, but it's all over the place in Mach's Principles of Mechanics. Explicit statement. For example, science tells you that if I seem to myself to put a burning match to a piece of paper or have such and such visual sensations, then I can expect to have visual impressions of the paper burning. Here I've expanded on an argument, page 69 of the English translation of Visualize. In other words, science itself, according to its great positivist representatives, doesn't even pretend to tell you the essence of physical reality. It only tells you about appearances. To ask for more is to talk nonsense, according to positivists. And what about the idealist philosophers? For example, Hegel and company. For the Hegelians, the empiricist and positivist sensations are aspects of mind, with a capital M. Of course, all nouns have a capital N. But what is mind? If the world is mind, it can't be my mind. That would be too solipsistic. So it must be consciousness in itself, or perhaps consciousness for itself. Something we do not experience the world or anything in it as. The philosopher's world ends up being nothing, or at least nothing that common sense in action is aware of. I have to skip over Rosenzweig's critique of philosophy's account of the essence of man, which he identifies with the question of the search for an essence of life. Interestingly, that's a very interesting section, for reasons of time. The critical point comes when Rosenzweig comes to philosophers' accounts of the essence of the nature of God. Rosenzweig has no trouble disposing to his satisfaction of what he calls mysticism, by which he means one contemporary German form of mysticism, according to which God is wholly other. He calls that, giving the patient that form of mysticism, he refers to as mystical, M-I-S-T-I-C-O-L, as if it were a drug, as a new pharmaceutical. Don't give the patient mystical. Like the doctrines that make the world and its matter into mind, mind into consciousness in itself, and this makes God nothing, according to Rosenzweig. And idealism, which makes God, man, and world all into mind, equals nothing. And Spinozistic pantheism, which makes God into nature, equals nothing, are all convicted of making God into nothing as well. What makes philosophy a disease in Rosenzweig's eyes What makes philosophy a disease in Rosenzweig's eyes is that while it starts from something valuable, namely wonder, that is a sense of the miraculousness and mystery of the existence of the world, of humans, and of God, freezes that wonder by turning it into philosophical wheel spinning. That's why I gave this slide the title, Don't Put Your Wonder in the Philosophy Phase. And now we come to a critical remark. So we've done the three of the 8 sections, moving back. Rosenzweig seems to believe that accepting any of these philosophical conceptions of God, Hegel's or Spinoza's, etc., is incompatible with a meaningful spiritual existence of God's reality. But I don't believe this is true. Maimonides, for example, if he doesn't talk about Maimonides, if you want a philosopher who makes God nothing, Maimonides would be a wonderful example. Maimonides thought God has no properties. Not even, no predicate that applies to anything else applies to God, not even exist. Nor does not exist. Nor does either exist or does not exist. God doesn't even have to obey logic. This should make Maimonides God a nothing for Rosenzweig, who does not discuss medieval negative theology as far as I know. Yet anyone who's read the Guide for the Perplexed must know that Maimonides did feel a profound sense of spiritual connection with God, an overflow from God as he describes it. And it's the 19th century, and I'm sure that many 19th century and early 20th century idealists, of whom there were a lot until World War I. Santayana said, and I've always been impressed by this, that every philosopher was an idealist until World War I, and no one was an idealist after World War I. The doctrine was just idealism was left not because it was felt to be an empty doctrine or to make God a nothing, but because it was too rosy, too optimistic. But I'm sure that many 19th century and early 20th century idealists found spiritual and not only intellectual sustenance in the Hegelian idea that everything that exists, including one's own consciousness and the world outside it, is part of God. There was a distinctive idealist spirituality. It's just not true that one has to have the right theology, if there is such a thing, to have a meaningful spiritual life. So we've now gotten through 4 sections that I outlined halfway through, and we go to existentialism. In my book, I refer to Rosenzweig, Buber, and Levinas as existentialists because I take the heart and soul of religious existentialism, beginning with Kierkegaard, to be a battle against turning religion into mere dogma. This is not to say that a religious existentialist must lack a creed. Kierkegaard was a Christian, and after all, and one with Christian beliefs. But for Kierkegaard, if Christianity becomes only a set of beliefs, then it's no longer a religion, no longer Christianity, no longer of any value at all. It becomes what Ingmar Bergman shows so beautifully in the first part of Fanny and Alexander, bourgeois, Danish, Swedish spirituality, circa 1907, if you see the movie. What the European bourgeoisie of Kierkegaard's time regarded as Christianity, he viewed with much of the same disgust as Nietzsche did. In fact, Georg Brandeis, who knew Kierkegaard and a correspondent of Nietzsche's, wrote Nietzsche urging him to read urging him to read Kierkegaard, and said, you know, as far as you're an atheist and he's a Christian, as far as I can say, you're saying the same thing. In Christianity, though not in Judaism, the dichotomy between faith and works is fundamental. And Christians have spilled a lot of the blood of fellow Christians over disputes about salvation through faith versus salvation through works. But from Kierkegaard's point of view, the 19th century bourgeois Christians misunderstood both works, which they understood as good deeds, and faith, which they understood as belief. For an existentialist, Christian or Jewish, the transformation of the whole of an individual's life, of which Edo speaks, involves the transformation of both the notion of faith and the meaning of good deed. Faith ceases to be equated with belief in some propositions, and good deed ceases to be equated with some conventional notion of doing one's duty. I say this because if Rosenzweig had accepted such doctrines as Torah Sinai, the Torah was dictated to Moses on Mount Sinai, that would not in itself have been incompatible with his being an existentialist. But what makes him a difficult thinker and this makes his discussion, what makes him a difficult thinker is his discuss with theologies according to which God is a human projection, theologies which he denounces as atheistic theology, while at the same time insisting on certain fundamental theses about God and redemption. What's problematic is the difficulty of determining just why and how he tolerates certain deviations from traditional belief and not others. If we can determine that, then I think we'll get a better picture of this complex thinker. So we come to Rosenzweig's non-traditional side, is toleration or indifference to certain traditional beliefs. Here are some examples of Rosenzweig's non-traditional sides. I discuss these in the second chapter of my book, the chapter mainly on Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption. I point out that although in a letter to the leaders of the Free Jewish Institute of Learning, the Lehrhaus, of which he was one of the founders, he dismisses text-critical approaches to Judaism. He mentions Wellhausen by name. Psychological approaches, he mentions William James and Freud, and sociological approaches, Max Weber, but he doesn't say that the text-critical scholars are wrong. Yes, if you looked at those of you who looked at Hertz's Chumash, all the time, Hertz is bashing Wellhausen and the text-critical scholars. But what Rosenzweig says is that we, practicing Jews, know Judaism differently. He says, what do we know when we do, when we know Judaism? Certainly not that all these historical and sociological explanations are false. That's an amazing statement. You said you mustn't think of God as a human projection, or the available God as a human projection. You mustn't touch that. You must say God is something. You must say he's not identical with the world, he's not identical with man. And then suddenly you're told, but you don't have to think about Torah Sinai, you don't have to think about psychological approaches to human religiosity and so on. What's going on? But he goes on. When he says, we practicing Jews know Judaism differently, and he goes on, what do we know when we do? Certainly not that all these historical and sociological explanations are false, but in the light of the doing, the right doing in which we experience the reality of the law, the explanation of halakha, the explanations are of superficial and subsidiary importance. That underlines the explanations are of superficial and subsidiary importance. So the truth or falsity of the doctrines of the infallibility and divine origin of the Bible, which text critics like Wellhausen call into question, are of superficial and subsidiary importance. It's really quite remarkable. Nor does Rosenzweig believe in reward and punishment and an afterlife, which he never mentions. Both in the last chapter of the Büchlein and in the first part of the Star of Redemption, death is something to be faced bravely, not something to be eluded. Nor does redemption in Rosenzweig, this is more debatable. Peter Gordon and I have debated about just what redemption means in Rosenzweig, but in my view, redemption does not involve a future messianic or post-messianic era. In one sense, redemption is simply God's love, which we can experience now. Something we regard as a Christian element in Rosenzweig, who was early tempted, inclined to convert to Christianity. But on the other hand, the denial of an afterlife is profoundly unchristian. Redemption is a present event. In another sense, we do perhaps anticipate redemption in some form in the future, but what that means we do not know and do not need to know. Quotes, thus man may act unconcerned with the outcome, you have the quote here. He may act according to the requirements of the world as it is today. That day, when action is required, let him understand what he must perform. The realm of time is the proper arena for his actions. He does not need to wait until truth has risen from its depths. I point out in my notes that the Rosenzweigs use the phrase "the demands of the day" is taken from a remark of Goethe's in Goethe's notebooks. He keeps saying, think about the demands of the day, not an afterlife, not the end of days. Think about the demands of the day. That little thing, Rosenzweig speaks of that little thing called the demand of the day. Don't wait for the truth to rise from the depths. So we're now up to putting all this together. Putting all this together, on the positive side, Rosenzweig insists on the reality, in a sense of positive theses versus negative theses. Rosenzweig insists on the reality of God, world, and man. Each is something, and not the vacuous nothing that the philosopher substitutes. The world is the world, and not appearance or consciousness on und für sich, or mere as if. Man, the name giver, is the bridge between God and the world, and God is simply God. The non-identity of world, God, no form of pantheism is tolerated by Rosenzweig any more than idealism. And man, who is both a part of the world and more than a part of the world, is absolute. These are, I claim, philosophical dogmas for Rosenzweig, however much he denounces philosophy. He may say that these dogmas, indeed the whole part one of the star, are of secondary importance, not worth anything by themselves. What is important is experiential philosophy, the new thinking. But experiential philosophy is, it seems to me, a name for a set of spiritual exercises for those and only those who accept these fundamental premises. At the same time, what I've called Rosenzweig's religious existentialism enables him to preach and teach, to experience Judaism and teach others to experience Judaism as in Hadot's language, a mode of existing in the world which had to be practiced at each instant, and the goal of which was to transform the whole of an individual's life. I have not concealed the fact that it's with his religious existentialism that I sympathize and not with the philosophical dogmas. And I have a question for Rosenzweig, if I could. Rosenzweig criticizes so many philosophies of religion as making God a nothing that I can't help wondering what justifies Rosenzweig in thinking that his God is something, really makes God more than a mere nothing. Is a bare something more than a mere nothing? A question which begins Hegel's logic, by the way. What he tells us is that regarding God as something is not to be understood as a claim of God's essence. It's an expression of a return to common sense in action. We are to use the name God and the other names we have for God, including Yahweh, YHWH, and Elohim, without thinking about or seeking a theory of God's essence. To use those names as healthy human understanding, guter Menschenverstand, requires. But just how does healthy human understanding require us to use the name God? We're supposed to realize that God loves us. That's the very heart and soul of Rosenzweig's faith experience and of his theology. And it's apparently to be taken literally. Hands off, you philosophers. But does that mean that God thinks about us? Does God have feelings? Do God's thoughts and feelings occur in time? No doubt Rosenzweig would say that if we ask these questions, we move from common sense and action to philosophy, from wonder at God's love for us to frozen speculation. But is the idea that we can think of God as loving and think of that as simply true? Every bit as true as that what I bought at the grocery was a piece of butter. To use an example of Rosenzweig's. While not thinking any of these philosophical thoughts about God. Is this really plausible? Like Wittgenstein, Rosenzweig wants a sharp line to separate healthy uses of words and unhealthy ones. But I am suspicious of the idea that such a sharp line exists, both in Wittgenstein and in Rosenzweig. Thank you.
So, are there questions or comments?
Jonathan? Oh, I'm sorry.
Hilary, you talked about, you raised a question for Rosenzweig about God. Rosenzweig seems to want to give some kind of weight or independent life to man, to human, to man, to ourselves, to the world, and to God.
Yeah.
So all three things.
Yes.
I'm just curious what you might say about the other two, which is, might they be also part of his philosophical dogmas?
I think Wittgenstein would think that, okay, I can sort of understand talking about the world and about things in the world, like slabs of butter, as common sense and action requires.
Yeah.
And when he says thinking about man as common sense requires, that becomes thinking about life as common sense and action requires, and that becomes living in the present. All right, that's fairly clear.
Yeah.
But isn't so clear what common sense and action, is there a way of thinking about God that's required by common sense and action? You can say, okay, I can sort of understand it. Okay, Wittgenstein, you might say Wittgenstein's saying a lot about what is to follow common sense and action when talking about things. And a lot about, and maybe Wittgenstein would say, okay, maybe you can talk about what common sense and action requires in thinking about life, although Wittgenstein is, I'll say a little more about that in a moment. But common sense and action and God, and especially it's probably because you might think when Wittgenstein says, okay, if you just read the Büchlein, you may say, okay, be commonsensical about God, which for many people would mean, okay, take it that God created the world, that God loves, and I'm especially to think that God loves me, that he thinks about me, is aware of me, and so on. It's not so, I'd say I have this, there's something which is very un-Wittgensteinian about counting thoughts about God on the same plane as thoughts about slabs of butter and even thoughts about life. And Wittgenstein, there is, I bought a little notebook kept by one of Wittgenstein's relatives, who's, I forget the name of this particular aunt, which turned out to be disappointing because although she had various letters to and from Wittgenstein, they were mainly, the letters back, the exchanges between her and Wittgenstein were mainly practical. You know, I mean, he was concerned with getting his relatives Jewish papers, for example, Aryan papers, so they could survive in Germany as count as Aryans and survive. He twisted his brother, the pianist, arm to make him penny up, pony up also. I knew Wittgenstein's grandniece, who knew nothing about her great uncle. I asked her once, what did you hear about Wittgenstein growing up? And she laughed and said, I heard he was the crazy uncle who gave away all the money. But one interesting philosophical remark I found in that whole notebook was in one letter to his aunt. He said that, I think that some things are good and some things are bad, but I don't ask why. Diese Frage liegt nur in mich. This question doesn't lie in me. Now maybe that's maybe that's like Wittgenstein's move with respect to God. I know God loves me, and I don't ask how he does that, or whether he has thoughts, or any feelings, or anything like that. Diese Frage liegt nur in mich. That sounds like a similar move.
Can I make a comment about that before we go on? I mean, I've fretted some over this question of God and common sense. It always reminds me of the line in a Beckett play, I've forgotten which one, where one character mentions God and the other character says, God, he doesn't exist, the bastard. So, in a certain sense, it's hard not to imagine a deity of some sort. So it's hard to escape. It's almost as hard to escape that thought as it is for Rosenzweig to escape the dogma he criticizes. So much for my comment.
Yeah.
There's a place, and I can't remember the exact context, where so one of the later essays where Rosenzweig is quoting somebody else, one of the people in his circle. I think it must have been maybe something he writes to Buber. He's quoting somebody else, and then he says, and it's something about the authoritative status of Jewish text. I don't remember the exact context, but then he says something like, I might have said the same thing myself. I can imagine those words coming out of my mouth. But when I heard them coming out of somebody else's mouth, I realized, I completely rejected them. And I've always found that moment quite poignant, because what they reflect, I think, is this tension about wanting to theorize, wanting to understand, and recognizing that the dogmas that one almost inevitably produces from that kind of philosophizing are dissatisfying, or don't live up. That was just observation. But the question I have is, I wonder if you could share with us, there's a kind of romantic, lowercase r, romantic celebration of a certain kind of simple spirituality for Rosenzweig. It's almost like he wishes he could be a different kind of person who had some kind of simple faith. The kind of person who could sort of unreflectively say, God loves me. So is there in fact that moment, and is that an attempt to kind of undo philosophy for him?
Well, I agree with you, except that I don't see any much regret in Rosenzweig. Just it's hard to find moments of regret in Wittgenstein.
Okay.
There is a certain kind of, they were not professors, they Rosenzweig rejected the professorship, Wittgenstein accepted the professorship, but he was not happy about that, and he worked as an orderly during World War II. There's a plaque, by the way, in a hospital where he worked as an orderly, that he invented a salve for wounds. A medical scholar told me that. He still remembered having the Wittgenstein's ointments. But apart from the question of whether he wished or whether he thought he had there, one is tempted, one can understand faith that God's love you when it's accompanied by belief that God is more or less literally a person. But to say that's of secondary or subsidiary importance, but I mean, the central, in my reading of the star, which is the second chapter of my little book, the central part of the star is the middle part of the star. And the first part is really, in the end, unsatisfactory, according to Rosenzweig himself. And the central part of the star, the central image, is the relation to God as marriage. And the romance followed by marriage, where he does some very clever things, like quoting the Bible, so you have God saying, "Where are you?" And then the answer comes not from Adam, right, but from Moses. And Rosenzweig doesn't even indicate that he's changing doing this jump. But so the image of, because God loves you, you're driven to do good because you're driven to be worthy of this lover. Don't you have to know more about this lover? Yeah. I have an anonymous lover, wouldn't do it for me. Yeah.
Well, I think that kind of goes along with my question. I understand Rosenzweig's rejection of dogma itself, but in rejecting it, he seems to reject inquisitiveness, and he forbids the asking of question, which in its very nature seems the polar opposite of dogma. Doesn't that forbid wonder, which is what he seems to thinks people should do, is wonder about that?
Well, that is you caught exactly what I'm driving at. I think that as I say, I have a problem with Wittgenstein too, like my colleague Warren Goldfarb and his teacher, Burton, like to talk about flat uses of words that are unmetaphysical and don't imply anything metaphysical, and metaphysical uses of words. And I want to say, isn't this distinction between a flat and a metaphysical use of words itself a metaphysical use of words? Yeah, the idea that I'm not sure it's even good Wittgenstein, because the idea that ordinary language is flat, it seems to me un-Wittgenstein. If anything, it seems to me Wittgenstein is saying ordinary language is deep enough. I regard it's funny because I can know where the Austrian metaphysics came from in Wittgenstein. I regard it as an unfortunate residue of his empiricist youth. And I don't know where it comes from in Rosenzweig. Yeah.
I'm thinking of two contrary literary examples. One form would say, God is a poetic idea which we embrace because it makes certain morally salutary things possible for us that would be otherwise impossible. And I can see that the critique of that is that it's not quite enough to say that I want to be good because it would upset my imaginary friend. At the same time, it does strike me that it is possible to use that kind of idea as a way of articulating a sense of wonder which it doesn't intend to propositionally capture. That leads me to the first literary idea, which is Stevens's idea of a supreme fiction, which is the fact that it's fictional does not mean that it's not supreme. I could see the power that that idea had for Stevens as a way of opening up spiritual possibilities for him without requiring him to say things that struck him as retrograde. At the same time, the difficulty with that idea is that it easily evaporates into merely a bath of warm, satisfying feelings. The alternative position would be a position taken by somebody like Flannery O'Connor, who says, if I think God is a symbol, then I might as well be done with him and say nothing. But the difficulty with that is that she's tied to certain propositional claims which are problematic and which actually motivate what strikes me as the really essential cruelty of her as a writer. That if you do not buy these propositions, then there's something wrong with you no matter how much you claim to be open to wonder. And I think between those two propositions, I simply can't find my way. I want to adopt the Stevens' view, but O'Connor's critique of that view is correct. At the same time, I can see the power of O'Connor's critique, but I could never embrace her faith.
Yeah, I can see this addressing directly my own uneasy balance. what I call naturalistic theology, or constructive, or like colleague Gordon Conklin called constructive theology. And the only part I disagree with the critique of is calling, oh, so you just want a warm, fuzzy bath. That's a soundbite. That's worthy of Fox News. And some great thinkers have, great writers have resorted to sound bites. When John Cardinal Newman is supposed to have said something, said, you know, you worship in your way and I'll worship in mine, and you worship in your way and I'll worship God in his. Oh, it's a beautiful sentence, but it's fundamentally the essence of intolerance.
Correct.
And another person who very similar was Chester, who was very fond of attacking anything that regarded.
Well, I say that as somebody who prefers the warm bath, I have to say. I mean, I understand the critique, but given the choice, I'm going to take the warm bath.
Me too. And I'm saying it's not just that I find, I mean, if I suppose a serious naturalistic theology of God, I say at an intellectual level, I think of, as I said in my book, as God in the foreword and after about myself, which was very brief, God is an ideal. And thinking of God as a person, as Kant said, God isn't a person, but that's how we have to think of him in this life. Which at least some, which I think is not true if we means everybody, but for some of us. I much prefer, that is to say, when I try to measure, evaluate my conduct, if I imagine a wise and good judge, a human judge, who I could dialogue in one preferably with a sense of humor, necessarily with a sense of humor, then just ask, thinking intellectually, how do my ideals, plus a lot of philosophical analysis, require me to conclude. But it isn't just that spirituality is of value to me because it connects with morality, because you can be a morally wonderful person and be an atheist. Spirituality, I think, is a value in itself, and there is such a dimension in human life, maybe not every human life, but sex isn't a dimension of every human life, but it's one I prefer to have a dimension of my life. And I prefer spirituality to be a dimension of my life. Yes, Sam?
Thinking about your book about the four Jewish thinkers.
3 1/4.
3 1/4. But specifically what Wittgenstein and Rosenzweig you talked about today is, when he talked about practice, to me the practice of being a Jew is being involved in the Jewish community. And it brings up the issue of going from temple to rabbinical Judaism and engaging in centuries of argumentation about what it is to be a Jew. Did Rosenzweig engage in any of that?
He built a lair house. It's a communal, and it was an attempt, he built a lair house, and the lair house is open to everyone. He only criticizes traditional forms of Judaism, traditional including Reform Judaism. I don't mean traditional just in the sense of Orthodox, standard forms of Judaism. He only criticizes when they become intolerant. I think as far as Judaism is concerned, I think he would have subscribed to William James' great maxim, be tolerant of everything that's not itself intolerant. He only gets critical, you know, when Reform Judaism says this is the right form of Judaism, or Orthodox, or as Simon Raphael Hirsch says, this is what Judaism is based on, Torah Messina, you have to believe in Torah Messina, etc. Then he gets scornful.
So did the Lair House study Judaism, or would they study Talmud?
Yes, study all,
Okay.
open all forms of Jewish study. But the other record that he recommends is have the courage to utter those words, we Jews. Once you've said to someone else, we Jews, acknowledging that you're speaking as a Jew, you've taken the first step. You know, the spirit in practice is extremely tolerant, in spite of and the intolerance comes with having been a German professor of German Dozet. And, you know, the favorite mode of speech of German professoria is from high to low. The haut en bas, as the French say. Stanley Cavell once said that a German intellectual pretends to have, maybe a continental intellectual pretends to have read everything, and American intellectuals pretend to have read nothing, and it's a pretense on both sides. Yeah. Andy.
Sorry, just, there are three things, but there are probably more, that Rosenzweig mentions in New Thinking that appears at the end of Star of Redemption that he picks up on in the little book as well, that he finds that philosophers do, taking now not just as a critique of German idealism or a particular kind of philosophy, but that this is one of the things, the troubles, these are three troubles that philosophers get into. He mentions, and two of which I think you share to some extent, or have been sort of felt that we get into trouble when we do them. One is reductionism.
Right.
Another is absolutism, a kind of wanting to reduce everything to one single thing. You yourself have raised questions about this in your own work.
Yeah.
So this goes back to something Steve mentioned right at the very beginning in introducing you, that there are some aspects of Rosenzweig's thinking that you can actually hear in Hilary Putnam's thinking.
Yeah, fine.
Right.
Look, his philosophical critiques of philosophy are brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, they're sarcastic, but they're brilliant. Just as Wittgenstein often has, very good. I argue, in fact, that Wittgenstein often builds a criticism of philosophical argument out of very traditional materials.
Yeah. I mean, he also seems to, he's critical of our taking things out of time. And that maybe gets back to what Sam was suggesting about going back and living a life in and through time, and within a community which takes time, etc. And just mention this, but you may not want to say much more about it, but wonder, when he attacks wonder, they're the two most famous philosophers that talk about wonder in the West, Socrates and Descartes, both say philosophy begins with wonder.
Yeah. Descartes
makes a big deal out of it in the Discourse on Method and says that his discoveries about the rainbow are his best illustration of the thing. But it's sudden and unexpected, Descartes says. Something happens and you're struck suddenly by something and it stops you. So there's a little element of what it is to be in wonder that is frozen-like. It stops you in your tracks. The rainbow suddenly appears and it's unexpected and can be taken in at a glance. And he sees that as, Descartes, as the beginnings of asking certain questions that are both philosophical and
so
the origins of modern science. And that's good.
Yeah, to Rosenzweig, Spinoza is just a pantheist, which is a dirty word. To Einstein, Spinoza is, it is almost his religion.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is why I think my own, I would not say, for example, that Hegel is nonsense or he's just violating ordinary language or anything of that kind, although of course Wittgenstein doesn't discuss Hegel because he hasn't read any philosophers except Bertrand Russell and Schopenhauer. He should be blunt, Wittgenstein, but to take Wittgenstein's sweeping criticism of philosophy seriously, ignoring the fact that he's read very little philosophy, he boasted that he hadn't read Aristotle, claimed at least not to have read a line of Aristotle. The attacks on Plato are juvenile. I would say, look, I can't inhabit the world of Hegel's logic, but I've directed theses on it, and if it were literally nonsense, I don't think I would have been able to. How would I have been able to evaluate either Hegel or the thesis if I couldn't understand it in any sense? No, I don't have, to use a different expression of Wittgenstein's, which I think is more accurate. If he hadn't gotten into this idea that there's a linguistic critique to be made, critique based on a theory of language, of metaphysics, and just that I don't have, there's one point where he says about the religious thoughts of one of his students, I don't have those thoughts of anything that hangs together with them, but not that they're nonsense. I think it's belief in one of his students who believed in an afterlife, and he said, I don't believe, it's in the lecture on religion, I don't have those thoughts or anything that hangs together with it. That seems to me our situation with respect to much of traditional metaphysics. But it's a wonderful, wonderful attempt to answer very difficult questions. And if we now think in a different way, that's true. But nonsense is not right. I'm hostile to philosophy bashing. Yeah.
I may be referring to one of those sound bites you were looking at. I don't know if it's Fox or not. But one such has to do with the distinction in Rosenzweig between Judaism and Christianity, which becomes almost an implicit philosophy of history, that the job of Judaism is to look inward, to be the sun, as it were. The historic job of Christianity, the rays, which brings to the world that news, perhaps in, not in 613 form or 12 forms, in 7, but at any rate. And which suggests that this common sense in action may stress the word common in common sense in action. As to whether there is a Jewish common sense in action and a Christian common sense in action, in view of that division of labor, which is implied by that soundbite. And if so, the awareness of it and the sense of, as it were, responsibility to it, the different tasks, the different vocations, does that enter at all into your thinking as a Jew?
Well, I think at least my thought, his attitude towards Christianity, I think, shifts. And it starts out that he wanted to convert to Christianity. That's because, like Kafka in the brief on their father, the letter to his father, which just excoriates what Kafka saw when he went to a synagogue. So maybe he just felt that, the Judaism that he saw was like the Christianity in Paddy and Alexander. Somehow Christianity seemed to be a more authentic religiosity. And the famous historical event is that the young Rosenzweig decided to convert to Christianity. Then he decided, I'll convert as a Jew. I'll go to high holiday services before I get baptized. And he went to the high holiday services, was deeply moved, and decided, I don't have to become a Christian, I'm already redeemed. Now that's where he starts. Christianity and Judaism are both paths to redemption, and Jews don't have to convert to Christianity because they are, quote, already redeemed. And then there is the sort of Hilary, or you hate to be called that, but it's Welthistorische account in which we are already redeemed, not in the sense that there's no changes in Judaism, but I think, even though he doesn't like the term essence, it's as if he thought there are no essential changes in Judaism. It is as if he thought there was a kind of core to Judaism which doesn't change, whereas Christianity has a historic mission to bring the rest of the people to where we are already. But then in the fragments of letters and so on collected by Glasser in Rosenzweig, The Life and Thought in his own words, you see later on, you begin to see some Christianity bashing. As if after years living in a Jewish world in the Lair house, this attraction has faded, this youthful love affair has faded. So I think remember, the guy is only, I think, 42 years old, 44, when he dies.
And not in good shape at that point.
And we don't know what if Rosenzweig had lived, what would have developed. That's a great tragedy. Well, maybe it's time for me to take my nap. Thank you very much.